Thank you for the invitation to speak to your group. And I am Joy O'Keefe. I'm a bat biologist and assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist in natural resources and environmental sciences here at the University of Illinois. And today I'm going to tell you about some of my research kind of embedded within research and news from other bat biologists to kind of put bats into context in terms of their ecosystem services. So first off, let me tell you a little bit about ecosystem services. This is the suite of goods or services that are provided by ecosystems and their inhabitants. And this is kind of a popular term to use when we're trying to demonstrate the value of protecting wildlife or the ecosystems that wildlife inhabits. And that could be anything, you know, from plants or microbes all the way up to organisms, including bats, often used as justification for the conservation of imperiled species like bats. So up at the top here, I have a paper that was published in 2011 by Tom Kuntz et al. About the ecosystem services and in this paper, they describe, you know, kind of the global ecosystem services, including supporting services like using guano as fertilizer. So that's bat poop. And in some places where it accumulates in large amounts, it is used for that. Or the indirect benefits, which could be from, you know, suppressing arthropods, like eating insects and other pests, pollination, or seed dispersal. Bats also play a provisioning role as a source of food in some cultures and regions where bats are bigger than they are here in Illinois. And then bats also figure positively in some cultures, which is actually another type of ecosystem service. So for example, in China and in India, bats are symbols of good luck and happiness, or they're revered through those regions. So this is really important to kind of find the value in bats, because we've seen a pretty significant change to our bat populations over time. And with this idea that bats are really important and that we need to protect them, I've observed a significant shift in the way that bats are perceived by the general public. And I attribute that to the glowing stories that we tell about bats in spaces like this one. For example, if you take a look at these headlines, some of these are from 2011. You'll see that bats are getting some positive press, so worth at least $3 billion a year, 3.7 billion bats. And then we've basically, once we put a dollar value on bats and began seeing massive declines in our bat populations, which is indicated by that graphic, it's supposed to be a graph of a bat declining on the left, then we started to see the language around bats become more positive and more hopeful. And of course, I love seeing bats get credit for the many ways that they benefit humans, but I think it's crucial that we don't exaggerate their roles in supporting the well-being of humans, because if we're found to be wrong about their value, that could ultimately weaken our credibility as scientists and then diminish support for bat conservation. So while these headlines are great, what I'm going to tell you today is how you should kind of take them with a grain of salt. So just a brief intro or outline to my talk. So first, I'm going to briefly talk about the status of bats and the threats that they face, both globally and regionally. And then I'll use some research from my lab and from others to try to convince you of two things. One, that bats have been undervalued in forests, and two, that we've given bats too much credit for insect suppression in big agriculture. And I'll save some time for questions at the end in case my arguments are at all muddy for you. So a quick introduction to bats. Bats are in the mammalian order Chiroptera, which means hand, wing. And bats really merit our appreciation merely for their intrinsic values, irrespective of their utility to us. So if you take a look at this vampire bat, for example, they're really marvelous to consider. There's 3 species of vampire bats in the world. They're all sanguinivorous, meaning they eat blood, but they're also remarkably altruistic and exhibit pretty spectacular social behaviors and relationships a friend of mine, Jerry Carter, who's at the Ohio State University, studies vampire bat social behaviors, and he has unearthed that they will feed each other. They exhibit this reciprocal altruism. And so if one bat goes out to feed and doesn't get a blood meal in a night, that can be pretty detrimental. After a couple of days of not eating, they'll die. And so they come back to the roost, basically posy up to another bat, lick on their face and tell them, hey, I didn't get enough blood, or I didn't get any blood. And then that bat will actually share their blood meal with their buddy. And Jerry originally hypothesized the bats that were doing this were closely related, but it turns out that they're not necessarily closely related, but instead they have formed these social bonds and are taking care of each other. So it's kind of, you take care of me today and I'll take care of you a week from now. So that's pretty remarkable. Bats are incredibly social, and there's still a lot to learn about their social behaviors, but just really neat animals. They're also incredibly diverse. So at present, we know of 1,462 species of bats, and this is always increasing. So you can check batnames.org for more information on that. And that means that Chiroptera is the second most speciose mammalian order behind the rodents. Bats are really super diverse in terms of their diet. So if you look at the dietary patterns listed here, they're eating everything from insects to fruit to nectar to fish. Some of them are carnivores. There's actually bats that eat other bats. There's bats that eat birds while they're migrating in Europe. And there are bats that eat frogs. And then, of course, the sanguivores that eat blood, as I mentioned. As you can see from this list, the only thing bats don't eat is grass. So now I want to delve into the status and threats to bats. And we'll first start with the global threats. So globally and locally, some of these factors come into play. Bats are at risk. At least a third of our bats in the world are considered data deficient by the IUCN, but I would argue it's much higher than that, because even for bats that we know a little bit about, there's still so much that we don't know. Bats are really difficult to study because they're mostly small, typically weighing less than 50 grams, or roughly 1/10 of a pound. And they're cryptic and they're nocturnal, so we very rarely see them. Plus, for bats that echolocate, which is most of them, the calls that they emit are above the range of human hearing, and they're difficult to identify from sonograms. So even when we record them, we don't necessarily know, who we're getting, and it's not as easy to survey them as birds, for example. But for bats that have been studied, we know that many populations are declining due to widespread habitat loss, and this is related in some cases to deforestation and harvesting, where trees are removed permanently, or where plants are harvested that are important roost sites for bats. Many bats are associated with plants as roosts. And then in addition to that, intensive land use for agriculture and development eats up natural habitats and sometimes generates toxic pollutants that bats can take up and potentially biomagnify, like pesticides. In many parts of the world, human disturbance like hunting or intrusions into critical habitats like caves is a serious issue that really hasn't been adequately addressed. That was a problem for bats here in Illinois for a long time, but we have taken steps to keep people out of important hibernation sites that bats occupy, and that has gone a long way towards reboosting their populations. And then urban development is also a concern, where we are basically eating away at natural habitats. In the Midwest, we have 13 species of bats, and they're all in the family Vespertilionidae. So we don't have the diversity of bats that you see in tropical parts of the world, but Illinois itself still hosts a remarkable number of bat species because of the karst features and major rivers converging in southern Illinois. And so the 13 species that regularly occur in Illinois are shown kind of overlaid with the map. And then on the far right side of the screen, we have two accidental species that show up here occasionally. One is the Seminole bat, which really wanders across the Midwest and the Northeast. It's a southern bat. That's the bat with the reddish colored fur. And then the free-tailed bat laying on a tree is a bat that's common in the South and the Southwest. So this is a bat that forms very large colonies, sometimes millions of bats, in caves in the South and Southwest. and then also has started to occupy human structures. And they both occasionally come into Illinois and probably will become more regular as the climate continues to warm. So actually, Illinois has quite a bit of diversity here. But as I mentioned, all but the free-tailed bat are in the family Vespertilionidae, and they all have a pretty simple diet of arthropods. So most of their prey items fall into 3 insect orders. And this is true for most bats that eat insects or arthropods: moths, flies, and beetles. But we are learning that bats aren't super selective about what kind of moths, flies, and beetles they eat. More so, they're looking at prey size and abundance, and then the ease of capture. So a particular size bat may only eat insects typically within a certain size range, because those are the easiest ones to capture. Now, in the Midwest, kind of going back to the threats that I mentioned, habitat loss occurs less rapidly than in some developing parts of the world. But when we consider the value of a small woodlot, such as what's pictured on the top left around Fishhook in Illinois, I think it's important to consider that some species are pretty long-lived and faithful and can return to the same forest and even the same roost year after year. So a small patch of woods could be actually fairly critical to a particular population of bats. So for example, some of our cave-dwelling bats in Illinois can live upwards of 20 years, and they will return to the same sites where there are trees to raise their young every summer. In the past 20 years, we've determined that wind energy actually poses a significant risk to bats that are moving between their summer and winter habitats, such as what's happening right now as bats are migrating back north. This is particularly true for our long distance migrants who don't hibernate in subterranean environments. These bats tend to fly higher, and they fly in the rotor swept zone of turbines, and they are found dead under turbines as they make cross-continental moves. So this is not only happening here in North America, but also happening worldwide. Wherever turbines are put up, migratory bats are running into them. And then on the bottom right hand, disease is also a problem. So since 2006, cave hibernating bats in North America have been devastated by a disease called white nose syndrome. This is caused by a fungus that invades bat skin tissues while they are hibernating and thus interrupts hibernation. Bats that have the fungus during the winter arouse more often, so they burn energy when they are arousing more frequently from a hibernation state, and they may actually starve to death if they burn through their fat reserves before the winters end. And this disease, white nose syndrome, has actually caused declines in several species, 4 in particular, and the deaths of millions of bats. So in terms of those bats that are declining, I want to go over this to just kind of give you a sense of how things are looking. So in terms of imperilment for bats, the landscape has changed quite a bit in the 23 years that I've been studying bats. So the Indiana bat has been listed since the inception of the Endangered Species Act. It was first proposed to be listed back in the 1960s. And then when the act was signed into law in 1973, it was on the list. And this is a bat that, every bat biologist in the eastern US needs to know something about, because we're likely to catch it in most places unless you get into the far south. The gray bat is the second species that was listed as federally endangered here in the US, and it was listed back in 1976. And these were the 2 species that, when I was first starting to work with bats in the East, these were the ones that you had to be concerned about. And for Indiana bats, they roost in trees during the summer. So there were concerns, for example, if you're putting in a power line or a road, and there's some federal funding that's associated with that project, then you're going to need to go out and do surveys for Indiana bats to find out if they are roosting in the trees that might be cleared for that project. The gray bat is a cave obligate bat, roosting in caves year-round, both in the summer and the winter. So it actually rears its pups inside a cave. But in recent years, we've discovered that gray bats pretty readily use human-made habitats, including culverts and bridges. And so now there's increasing inspections of bridges and structures like that in places where gray bats occur. But this was pretty, simple compared to the way the landscape has changed in the past few years. So as a result of white nose syndrome, the northern long-eared bat, which was once one of the most frequently detected bats in our surveys in forests, was listed as federally threatened due to widespread declines from white nose syndrome. So it was listed in 2015, and it has just been upgraded to federally endangered because of its continued declines from white nose syndrome and basically just absent from the landscape where we used to capture it. Next up is the tricolored bat, also once a very common bat, but now proposed for federally endangered status due to declines from white nose syndrome. And we'll find out about that one later this year. And then finally, the little brown bat is really experiencing serious declines due to white nose syndrome in some parts of its range. And interestingly, this species is found across North America, almost all of the United States, and then most of the southern part of Canada. You can easily find little brown bats, or you could in the past. And it has been proposed for listing, but it's too soon to say how Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is going to deal with this species. And one interesting factor is that little brown bats are also considered a nuisance to humans because they tend to roost in anthropogenic structures. Now, some other declining species that I want to mention are the eastern red bat and the hoary bat. And neither of these species has received formal consideration by the federal government, but it's worth noting that both of them are experiencing potentially population level declines. These two species comprise the bulk of the mortalities at wind energy sites in much of the United States. The eastern red bat is only found on the east side, but the hoary bat is found across the continent. And some researchers have even suggested that red bats might be declining due to loss of natural habitats. And unfortunately, it's really difficult to understand the status of these and other long distance migrants because they don't aggregate in large numbers in hibernation sites during the winter since they migrate. And so they're very difficult to count and to track over time. So that's the end of my, kind of status of the bats portion of my talk. And now I want to move into my arguments for that bats are underrated in forests. First off, so I think we really haven't given bats adequate credit for their role in the health of our forests. And I want to talk about that in light of forest management. So we have been studying bats in forests for quite a long time. And the reason for that is because we were curious about how bats were responding to forest management, particularly animals like the Indiana bat pictured here, who are roosting in trees during the summer. We know that, as I mentioned before, deforestation and logging can be threats to wildlife and ecosystem integrity. So we've really paid special attention to the way that these endangered bats use our forests. And in the eastern United States, prior to the listing of these other species, most of the work on bats in forests centered around the Indiana bat because of its federally endangered status. And resource managers like the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and state agencies have funded and contributed to studies to help us craft policies for forest management that are not only conducive to the protection of bats and their essential habitat, but also help us to meet the other objectives for ecosystem management, such as restoring oak and hickory forests. And understanding the effects of forest management on bats has really been a mainstay of my career. So I did my dissertation work and my postdoc work with bats and forest management, including harvest and prescribed fire in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. Then I moved to Indiana and I took over the leadership of the bat portion of a project called the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, which I still work on now that I've moved over to Illinois. So during my 10 years on this project, I've graduated 3 PhD students and I have another one in progress. And initially, our work on this project was motivated by concerns about how bats respond to forest management. But over the years, we've begun to shift our focus to include work on the role of bats as providing ecosystem services in the central hardwoods forest system. In general, our work has shown that bats are coexisting with management in this landscape and even selecting for features like clear cuts and patch cuts and shelterwood cuts. Human-made ponds, there's small ponds scattered throughout the forest, and then also roads. So some examples of this, Scott Bergeson, a PhD student, studied Indiana bat roosting habitats and habits in the landscape there for several years, and learned that maternal females and their pups who are roosting together are most likely to be roosting in clearings, whether that be patch cuts or shelterwood cuts or power line corridors. So if you look at the graphic here, you can see roosts used by females, males, and then random points is kind of what's available on the landscape. And females use clearings, the white space on the graph, significantly more than what's available on the landscape. And then they use the forest matrix, which is kind of just, thinned forest that's pretty intact with a closed canopy. They use that less than expected based on what's on the landscape. Scott later analyzed data for the northern long-eared bat in the same landscape and found that they also use harvest areas, but not quite as often as Indiana bats. And my current student, Reed Crawford, is studying Indiana bat roosting habitats and habits on the He as well. And he's continued to find Indiana bats roosting in dead trees in cuts such as this one on the right. So in fact, this tree on the right was deliberately killed by chainsaw girdling in order to promote the conditions that are conducive to the regeneration of oaks and hickories, which are desirable trees in hardwood forests. So another student of mine, Tim Dival, and then Elizabeth Bielke, two other students, tracked bats as they moved across the landscape at night. And I want to share with you kind of the results from their work. So on the left side of the screen, you see an example of what Tim found when he looked at the habitat use of northern long-eared bats versus what was available. So looking at this graph on the left, you see that on the top, most of the habitat available is centered around this, kind of openings, patch cuts, thinnings, so kind of marginal openings, not completely opening up the forest. And then there's clear cuts are way different, and they're over off to the left. When we look at the bats, the individual numbers on the bottom portion of the graph show individual bats, and you can see that most bats kind of align themselves with that vertical axis using historic openings, water, patch cuts, and recent thins. And there was just one bat that used a clear cut. So we found a similar pattern for Indiana bats, although Indiana bats used clear cuts more than expected. So there were more bats shooting off to the left there. Now, Liz tracked eastern red bats for 3 summers and looked at their foraging behaviors. And eastern red bats is one of those migratory bats. And here you can see that at the population level, that eastern red bats were more likely to forage closer to maintained and recent openings. So if you look at the graph on the right side, or the series of graphs on the right side, you'll see that the probability of population level habitat selection is greater on the y-axis wherever we're closer to maintained openings, closer to recent openings, closer to roads, closer to ponds. But then bats are less likely to be present closer to streams, openings, historical openings, and thin stands. And the reason that streams don't pop up is super important is that in this landscape, those streams are actually dry, whereas the ponds are actually the sources of water for these bats. So during the summer, these streams don't hold very much water. So that's really interesting because it shows in both of these cases that bats are actually not only roosting, but also foraging near these management features. While studying habitat selection by foraging bats, we also had the occasion to study their space use. And I'm sharing these data with you here because I want you to think about these later on in my talk when we talk about agriculture. So space use data are really helpful for making conservation decisions, but they also kind of confound our predictions of what bats might do based on their body sizes. So if you haven't already gleaned this from my earlier photos, the northern long-eared bat is actually the smallest bat of the 3 bats that are listed here. And it has a medium-sized home range. The eastern red bat is actually the largest of the 3 bats listed here, but yet its home range is way smaller. It's half of what the northern long-eared bat's home range is, and basically less than a third of what the Indiana bat's home range is. So that is counterintuitive. And it's interesting to think about how these bats move around in space. A bat that migrates from here to, say, Texas uses a rather small area, the eastern red bat, during the summer when it's foraging. So we already knew that forests were important to bats, and that's why we go to forests to catch bats every summer. But are bats important to forests? So I've been really curious about this for a long time, and I thought surely the answer was yes, but we really didn't have any data to assert this as a fact. And so starting back in 2013, I began to investigate this with some of my students. So in 2013, I invited Tim Dival to join my lab, and starting in 2014, he began to study bat diet as a major part of his dissertation work. And so basically we go out, we catch really cute bats like this one on the top left, the Indiana bat. We take guano from them when they poop in the bag while we are holding them, and then we can just take that guano back to the lab and work it up, and then we can let the bat go and move on. So at the time that Tim began to work on this in 2014, the technology was relatively new, and so we really had a lot to learn. And he collected guano samples for Indiana bats and for northern long-eared bats. While northern long-eared bats were just declining right before our eyes, we started to have a real difficult time capturing them. And basically by the end of his study, we were no longer able to capture them. Starting in 2017, Elizabeth Bilkey followed up on Tim's work to collect samples from eastern red bats and big brown bats at the HE project. And in the near future, we're going to compare the diets of all 4 species. But for now, I want to just share with you the data on the Indiana bats and the northern long-eared bats diets. So we found around 500 prey items in the diets of each of these species. So they're really not picky. They're eating just basically anything they can come across, one would think, if you look at like the numbers. But Tim did something really novel with his data, which gives us more insights into their diets. For each prey item, he consulted different sources to look at the animal's total body length. And from this, we were able to build a database of prey sizes and look at bats' preferences for prey sizes. And in kind of a confounding result, the Indiana bat, which has the lines in purple here, is a slightly larger bat. But when you look at the vertical dashed line and the vertical solid line, you're seeing the average prey size for Indiana bats dashed versus northern long-eared bats, slightly smaller bat. And what we see is that the Indiana bat is always eating a slightly smaller beetle, fly, moth, or other type of insect. And this gives us some insights maybe into how bats are consuming insects. So we see that Indiana bats tend to eat a lot of small flies. And otherwise, these 2 species are fairly evenly matched in terms of types of prey, but northern long-eared bats are eating slightly larger prey. And that's probably because they are gleaning prey, basically flying around in the forest and picking bugs off of leaves and off of bark. Whereas Indiana bats go out and find swarms of insects like swarms of flies and eat those. So this is a really cool finding from this work. But of course, you're probably just interested in like, what are they eating? At the species level, the most common prey by frequency of occurrence across the 2 bat species were 2 oak-feeding moths and a leafhopper. They also frequently consumed some large forest moths and a large wood cockroach. That was for northern long-eared bats. And then for Indiana bats, mosquitoes, Aedes vexans, was a common prey item, as were 2 small beetles. We detected a number of agricultural and forest pests, such as leafhoppers, leaf rolling and vegetation boring moths, and weevils, or a particular type of beetle. And you can see the top 5 major types of prey for the 2 species listed here: crane flies, mosquitoes, then beetles, then tiny moths, microlepidopterans, and then leafhoppers, all of which, of course, can be pest species in some way or another. Well, except crane flies. I'm not aware of them being pests. So noting that bats were consuming such a variety of forest pests, Tim and Liz Bielke and I conceived a study that would really become a cornerstone of Liz's PhD work. She's now a postdoc in my lab, but she conducted this work over 3 summers during her dissertation, and it was recently published in the journal Ecology. So every summer, Liz and her crew would set up 6 to 7 pairs of plots. They actually set up 7 every summer, but one summer, one got busted by a storm and a tree fell on it. So each time she set up a pair, she had a control with no net. And that's what you see on the top left here. And in the control site, birds and bats had access all the time. So what there was just a series of poles and wires, but there was no net. Then she also set up a bat excluded plot, and you see that on the right side of the graphic. So in the bat excluded plot, during the day, the mesh was open so that birds could have access. But then every evening, Liz or her technicians would go and close the plot and leave it closed for the night. And this had kind of a sliding door thing so that the mesh completely enclosed the plot around 5 sides. And then bats didn't have access, but insects still did. So we did look at who could get through this screening or mesh, and we could see that large moths could get through them and large butterflies could get through. And then inside, Liz monitored oak and hickory seedlings in each plot, measuring insect density and leaf area at the beginning and the end of the summer. And what she did is then measured the percent defoliation and the amount of insects on the plants. And what she found is that where bats were excluded, the leaves in general on saplings suffered 5 times more defoliation compared to control plots where bats had access at night. So that's this graphic of the 2 different leaves, 14.5%, 5 times more than 2.8%. When we looked at the effects by oaks versus hickories, the 2 graphs on the right, you can see that oaks were more affected. So when bats were excluded, we saw a stronger difference between the control dot and the bat excluded dot. So basically oaks were actually 3 times more affected by bat exclusion than were hickories. And so this experiment actually showed that not only are temperate forests important to bats, but bats are benefiting forests by suppressing pests that feed on important trees. And in fact, bats could play a role in forest composition because there were differential effects with a stronger effect on oaks than on hickories. So there's still more work to do to discover the ways that bats are benefiting forests, but I'm certain that we're going to unearth more data to support the notion that a healthy bat population is a significant component of a healthy forest. So now I want to move on to the last part of my talk, which involves pulling apart an argument that's been made in the literature for about 12 years now, which is that bats are vital to big agriculture. So I want to highlight a publication from my colleague Justin Boyles, which was born out of the same mindset that yielded the first paper I cited on the ecosystem services of bats. This paper came out in 2011 at the same time as that ecosystem services paper. And the idea here is that by demonstrating the value of bats' supporting role in our food production, people will feel more inclined to support bats. So this is a policy paper. It's not actually a scientific study, but kind of a look at some data and saying, hey, bats are really important. And this idea came at a critical time period when, as I mentioned before, bats were declining both from literal impacts with wind turbines, from white nose syndrome, which is the disease affecting cave hibernating bats. And so Boyles and his co-authors used some data from a few studies that were mainly on free-tailed bats and mainly conducted in Texas to apply a value to bats' pest control services in agriculture, and then expand that to every county where agriculture is grown in the United States, and basically say, hey, this is the value of bats. And so this paper shows that bats may be worth billions of dollars to agriculture. So since this paper was published in Science Magazine's Policy Forum, it has been cited over 1,000 times and used to justify urgent conservation actions for bats. So in short, it's really been great for bats. But I'm going to tell you about a response letter that was written by 2 environmental economists, Fisher and Nido, which called into question the broad extrapolations that were made in this paper. So they basically wrote a response piece to this, and these types of papers often get lost. I recently wrote one myself in response to somebody's critique of one of my papers, and I realized like nobody's ever going to read this because it's just a small little tidbit that gets kind of buried in journals. But in this Fisher and Nido response, they point out that the original paper makes errors that environmental economists really seek to avoid. And they ask for more deliberate scientific study using state-of-the-art methods to collect empirical data to inform conservation policy decisions. So basically, don't take the data from a few counties in one state and extrapolate it to all agriculture everywhere and guess a value of bats, because that's kind of rash, and as they say, extrapolating off the bat instead of going out and collecting these more deliberate data. So I'd say this critique from Fisher and Nido might have motivated Boyles to do a more deliberate study, which involved gathering data on how bats impact corn. And indeed, he and his student, Josiah Main, conducted an outstanding 2-year study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, which, as you can see from the title here, says that bats initiate vital ecological or agroecological interactions in corn. So here they were working in a matrix of agricultural fields in Southern Illinois, and they conducted an exclusion experiment, just like the one I described to you. And in fact, they told us all about their setup and their nets so that we could do our forest experiment a few years later. And in this experiment, where they excluded bats at night, but not during the day, they demonstrated that bats significantly reduced the densities of corn earworm larvae on corn in these fields. And they also reduced pest-associated fungi like Fusarium graminearum, which occurs in corn ears that are damaged by the corn earworm larvae. And this Fusarium can cause a toxic byproduct, and it can actually spoil a whole batch of field corn. And so this study really showed, not only are bats limiting the corn earworm, but they're also limiting the development of this fungus, which can, be quite costly if it spoils a batch of corn. So from their data, Main and Boyles extrapolated the value of bats to all cornfields globally and estimated that bats annually contribute around $1 billion US in pest control for non-BT and BT corn. And if you're not familiar with BT corn, that is corn that is genetically modified to be resistant to pests. There's bacterial DNA that is incorporated into the DNA of the corn, and when pests bite into the corn, they die and are not able to reproduce. So my takeaways from this study are that while there is no dispute that bats eat pests of corn and other crops, I think we should still avoid extending these ad hoc calculations of the value of their ecosystem services to unstudied areas and crops. Field corn is grown in over 90 million acres in the United States, but the way that bats are going to forage over corn is going to vary by landscape, by bat species, and across the growing season. So one key difference, in case you're not familiar with Southern Illinois, between this Southern Illinois landscape and other places where field corn is grown, is the proximity to forests. Some bats might avoid venturing out into vast open spaces that are primarily devoid of trees. And trees, as I've shown you, are important roost sites for bats, and they offer safe havens from predators. And a lot of our insectivorous bats tend to exhibit vegetation hugging behavior where they fly along the tree line. These tree lines may offer more insect prey, and they also create logical flight paths in mosaic landscapes. So just as larger bats are more likely to eat larger prey items, larger species are likely to fly farther out into their tree line, away from the tree lines, because their larger wings and long-ranging echolocation calls make them better adapted for flying in these open spaces. So let's shift to a landscape that is the one that surrounds me, just a mile or so away from me. I can be in a vast expanse of cornfields here around Champaign, Illinois. This is the southeast side of Champaign County, which is dominated by large corn and soybean fields, many of which are distant from forest corridors and buildings that could serve as daytime refugia for bats. So how likely is it that bats are venturing out over these big agricultural fields, and that there's an even distribution of their pest control services across this landscape? So let's zoom in on this section here to see how things might play out where bats are present. So we're just going to hone in here on the Salt Fork Creek over in southeast Champaign County. And recall the foraging home ranges that I showed you from the hardwood ecosystem landscape we looked at earlier. So 81 hectares on the left is a typical redback foraging range. And on the right, I've melded the two Myotis species together and averaged them to make a 272 hectare foraging range. If we overlay these home ranges on the forest bordered by ag fields just east of Sydney, Illinois, we can see it's pretty unlikely that these bats are going to venture out very far over the corn and soy fields. Both of these types of bats would prefer to forage in or along the edge of the forest anyways, because we know this from the work we did assessing bats' use of managed forests. And if we zoom out, it seems very unlikely that these bats are foraging over the areas more distant from the forest edge. And we could put radio tags on these bats and track them as we did in the forested landscape, but there's actually another way that we can assess the activity patterns of bats, which is by using acoustics. And so we did a study in this in 2021 in my lab. So in 2021, my postdoc, Louis Hunink, and other students working in my lab tested the hypothesis that bats' foraging activity would decrease the further you got from forested habitat that could provide roost sites and refuge for bats. And so from June to September, they deployed bat detectors along 10 transects. And you can see how that looks on the landscape here. These little white dots on the map, each set of dots is a transect. And we put bat acoustic detectors that record bat echolocation calls at 0 meters from the tree line, like basically right up near the tree line, 500 meters, 1,000 meters, and then doubling to 2,000, and then doubling again to 4,000 meters from the forest edge. And as expected, what we found is that bat activity decreased with distance from the forest edge. So this graph on the top right shows you 3 different types of bats. We basically grouped the bats that occur here into 3 phonic groups, which is related to the frequency of their echolocation calls. And so let's start at the bottom, the high frequency bats. That's going to be our Myotis, like the Indiana bat or the northern long-eared bat. And they were basically very rarely active over corn and soy fields. They seem to be sticking to the forest, and so we rarely recorded them at all. So you can see that line on the bottom suggesting that that doesn't matter about distance. They're just not out there. Then when we look at the mid-frequency bats, that's typically going to be our eastern red bats, but also evening bats and tricolored bats. And those bats are more active, typically 5 calls per night when we are close to the forest, but their activity drops off as we get out to 4,000 meters or 4 kilometers away from the forest. And then the most interesting group is the bat we would expect to forage over agriculture, the big brown bats, hoary bats. These are our largest bats, and they're our lowest frequency echolocation calls. So typically, well, not typically, always bats that are larger give lower frequency calls. Their calls carry across longer distances, and they eat bigger prey items. And these bats were active, around 25 calls per night when you were really close to the forest, and then dropping to around 12 calls per night as you got about 4,000 meters away from the forest. So about half the activity. So this study basically shows that not only do the ecosystem services of bats not extend equally to all areas of a large field, but that it definitely varies according to type of bat. And this means that previous estimates of the value of bats' ecosystem services have been inflated. So in contrast to the way we grow corn, soy, and wheat in the Midwest, many specialty crops like grapes and olives and nuts and rice are often grown at much smaller scales. And there are many studies happening right now across the globe, and some that have already been published, that have sought to evaluate the ecosystem services of bats in these small specialty crops. And molecular diet analyses have proven that bats are eating crop pests in many agricultural systems. And we definitely need more work to demonstrate that bats are actually suppressing crop pests, though. And that's the kind of work that you do with the deliberate exposure experiments, like the one we carried out in the temperate forest system. So I just want to close with this notion. This is the northern long-eared bat, that it has declined so much that it is now listed as federally endangered, whereas when I first started studying bats, it was incredibly common to capture. And this bat, we don't have a lot of opportunities to assess their ecosystem services anymore because they are so difficult to capture. But I think it's important just to value the bats for their intrinsic value. They're really incredible creatures with really interesting habits. As I mentioned, highly social, long-lived, and we have a lot to learn from bats. And I think that, it's really exciting to continue studying bats and try to unearth their ecosystem services and their values to us, but that we should just value them because they're just really cool. So with that, I'd like to thank the many students, collaborators, and sponsors who've worked with me on these various projects, and of course the bats themselves. And I will take time to answer any questions that you have now.